Responsibility without gods. The question is often asked as if it were small, almost trivial. What difference does belief make? What changes, really, if one accepts or rejects the idea of a god? The answer is neither subtle nor marginal. It is absolute. It shapes how a person understands truth and illusion, knowledge and assumption, courage and submission. It draws the line between clarity and confusion, between standing upright and bending the spine. It is the difference between mistaking shadows for substance and learning how light actually behaves. Once the earth was imagined as flat, because imagination was allowed to rule where observation should have spoken. Once, humanity placed itself at the center of the universe, not because evidence supported this belief, but because vanity demanded it. The same habit persists wherever belief is protected from examination. When explanation is replaced by reverence, error becomes sacred. There are two ways to look at existence. One claims that life was designed, that human beings were shaped with intention, purpose, and judgment already built in. In this view, knowledge is suspicious, curiosity dangerous, and disobedience the original crime. The other view accepts uncertainty without fear. It sees the universe as vast, indifferent, and unresolved. It understands human beings as learners rather than creations, as unfinished rather than fallen. The consequences of these views could not be more different. If existence is governed by an all-seeing authority who forbids inquiry, then submission becomes the highest virtue. Time is spent not on improving life, but on apologizing for living. Suffering is rebranded as moral necessity. Pain is explained instead of relieved. The mind turns inward, policing itself, fearful of offending a power it cannot see and cannot verify. But if life is understood as a natural process rather than a moral trial, effort turns outward. Attention shifts from appeasement to improvement. Intelligence is not a gift but an achievement. Knowledge is not inherited but earned slowly through error and correction. In this view, human responsibility does not shrink, it expands. Without a cosmic overseer to blame or praise, individuals must answer to one another. If humanity were intentionally designed, the design would be difficult to defend. A being constructed with such fragility, such vulnerability to pain, disease, and confusion would reflect either incompetence or cruelty. To argue that suffering is deliberate, that misery is part of a hidden plan, is to excuse horrors that no ethical mind should tolerate. The idea that life is a punishment presupposes guilt, yet no one chooses to be born. The doctrine of atonement turns existence into a prolonged apology. Under its logic, illness becomes deserved, sorrow instructional, and death a correction. This worldview trains people to distrust happiness, to see joy as suspicious and pleasure as morally unsafe. Self-denial is elevated into righteousness. The more one suffers, the more virtuous one is presumed to be. From this logic grows an entire culture of self-inflicted hardship. Bodies are punished in the name of purity. Comfort is rejected as weakness. Natural desires are treated as evidence of corruption. The goal is not to live well, but to endure poorly with the proper attitude. Worse still, this suffering is not kept private. It demands imitation. Misery insists on company. History shows the results clearly. Time and energy are diverted away from homes, education, and health, and poured instead into structures meant to impress invisible judges. Temples rise while hospitals wait. Ritual multiplies while understanding stagnates. Lives are spent preparing for an afterlife that never arrives, while the only life available is neglected. Religious obsession produces hallucinations of behavior as well as belief. One person equates dirt with holiness, another cleanliness with sin. Some mutilate their bodies, others starve them, still others deny themselves speech or companionship. These acts are praised as devotion, though they would be recognized as pathology in any other context. When belief shields behavior from criticism, madness can wear the mask of virtue. Every age has produced its catalog of sacred absurdities. Laughter condemned on certain days. Movement forbidden or required without reason. Human anatomy treated as an offense against heaven. Desire declared shameful not because it harms, but because it exists. None of this emerges from evidence. It arises from fear, disciplined and ritualized. Those who reject this framework are often accused of moral emptiness. Yet the opposite is true. To deny that humans are inherently depraved is not to deny responsibility, but to ground it. Without the excuse of divine command or cosmic punishment, ethical behavior must rest on its real consequences. Harm matters because it injures. Kindness matters because it heals. Disease, for example, is not a message. It is not a verdict. It is a natural outcome of biological processes interacting under specific conditions. To treat illness as punishment is to misunderstand both morality and medicine. Progress against disease has never come from prayer, but from study. Epidemics were not ended by repentance, but by sanitation, observation, and intervention. Appeals to the supernatural have consistently delayed relief. When illness was attributed to invisible forces rather than observable causes, suffering multiplied. Only when disease was studied as a natural phenomenon did humanity begin to reduce its power. Knowledge, not submission, proved effective. Those who claim special access to divine protection offer no evidence of exemption. They grow ill, age, and die like everyone else. They are subject to the same weaknesses, the same errors, the same temptations. Their status grants no immunity from biology or fate. If they cannot prevent suffering in their own lives, their promises regarding unseen worlds deserve skepticism. Authority that cannot demonstrate itself in reality should not be trusted with eternity. Power that fails under observation has no credibility beyond it. To claim influence in an afterlife while displaying helplessness in this one is not faith, it is presumption. Life itself is filled with illusion. Appearances deceive easily. The sun seems to move, the earth feels still. Without inquiry, sensation becomes belief. Early humans interpreted the world through the limits of their understanding, attributing intention where only process existed. Pain was moralized because causation was unknown. Mystery became motive. Nature does not select for beauty or fairness. It selects for persistence. What survives is not what is admirable, but what functions within its environment. Poison and nourishment grow side by side, sustained by the same conditions. To call one holy and the other cursed is to misunderstand the system entirely. Every organism experiences the world as if it were central. As animals could articulate belief, each would declare itself the purpose of existence. Survival, not design, explains persistence. There is no preference written into the structure of reality. Once this is understood, a shift becomes possible. Humanity no longer sees itself as a favorite child or a cosmic mistake. It becomes a participant in a process, neither exalted nor condemned. Responsibility becomes practical rather than theological. Problems are approached as challenges, not tests. Recognizing a problem is the beginning of solving it. Denying it in the name of faith guarantees its continuation. We are not fallen. We are unfinished. We inherit the marks of our evolutionary past, strengths and limitations alike. Knowledge does not arrive fully formed. It is built, slowly, painfully, through effort. The mind, like the body, requires nourishment and exercise. Without education, it atrophies. If reverence alone were sufficient, schools would be unnecessary. Yet without teaching, language itself never develops. Thought requires tools, and those tools must be learned. Intelligence is not revealed, it is cultivated. Truth can be corrupted just as food can be stripped of nutrition. When ideas are refined until nothing useful remains, they fill the mind without strengthening it. Superstition is intellectual malnutrition. Civilization advances only when education is prioritized over obedience. Institutions that fear learning do so because learning dissolves their authority. An informed person is difficult to command with myths. Fear spreads like disease. Ignorance creates monsters, and monsters justify control. Those who claim to protect humanity from imagined dangers often profit most from maintaining them. The pattern is old. Terror first, explanation later. Threats of punishment create dependence. Dependence becomes power. Power resists scrutiny. And so the cycle repeats. As long as injustice exists, reverence for a perfect overseer insults reason. A universe that permits unnecessary suffering cannot be morally governed. To excuse cruelty by attributing it to divine will is to abandon ethics entirely. When loyalty is divided between humanity and an abstraction, humanity always loses. Love aimed upward vanishes into silence. Love directed toward others produces consequence. The word used to justify this silence has been stretched beyond meaning. It has become a container for contradiction, invoked to end arguments rather than resolve them. It explains nothing and excuses everything. In the wrong hands, it overrides evidence and paralyzes thought. Fear has never been the foundation of wisdom. It has been the tool of submission. It has driven people to sacrifice joy, relationships, and life itself in the name of something that never answers back. Once fear is installed deeply enough, escape becomes difficult. Even when presented with evidence, the mind hesitates. Superstition, once internalized, resists removal. It binds identity as well as belief. Yet history offers proof of what happens when minds are freed. Where governance separates belief from law, progress accelerates. Where inquiry is protected, knowledge multiplies. When gods are removed from politics, humans begin to matter. More advancement has occurred in recent centuries than in millennia before, not because humanity changed its nature, but because it changed its assumptions. Once thought was liberated, invention followed. Medicine, science, communication, and industry transformed daily life beyond recognition. Pain was reduced, not by resignation, but by anesthesia. Life expectancy increased, not by prayer, but by hygiene and understanding. Disease was challenged, not sanctified. Each advance was resisted by those who saw suffering as sacred. Every improvement required defiance. Each relief of pain was once condemned as interference. Yet progress persisted, indifferent to outrage. Reality does not consult belief before functioning. What followed was not moral collapse, but moral expansion. When suffering was no longer explained away, it demanded response. Compassion became active, rather than ceremonial. This is where the choice becomes unavoidable. Submission or responsibility, fear or clarity, stagnation or progress. And the decision is not abstract. It is lived daily, in how time is spent, how others are treated, and how the future is imagined. This is where the thinking voice begins, not as comfort, but as challenge. Part 2. When belief retreats, something unexpected happens. Responsibility expands. Without a higher authority to absolve failure or justify cruelty, human action gains weight. Excuses evaporate. There is no plan to hide behind, no cosmic accounting to correct errors later. What is done here matters, because here is all there is. This realization unsettles those accustomed to deferral. It removes the comfort of postponement. Justice delayed is justice denied, not only socially, but existentially. No future reckoning will repair present harm. No invisible balance sheet will compensate for neglected compassion. What remains is the immediate, irreversible consequence of action. For centuries, progress advanced in spite of resistance rather than with encouragement. Each discovery that reduced suffering was accused of arrogance. Each attempt to understand nature was framed as defiance. The irony is sharp. Curiosity, the very trait that improves life, was treated as transgression. Knowledge was portrayed as theft, enlightenment as betrayal. Pain, especially, was defended with religious fervor. To ease it was to interfere. To endure it was to obey. This inversion transformed cruelty into obedience and mercy into rebellion. Yet pain yielded anyway, not to obedience, but to understanding. When anesthesia was introduced, suffering lost its supposed moral necessity. Relief did not collapse ethics, it refined them. The same pattern repeated across disciplines. Anatomy advanced when bodies were studied rather than sanctified. Nutrition improved when food was analyzed instead of blessed. Disease retreated when causes were identified rather than moralized. Each gain followed the same rule. Observation first, explanation later. These advances did not make humanity colder. They made it more capable. Compassion became practical. Sympathy became effective. The question shifted from, why must this happen, to how can this be prevented? That shift marks the transition from resignation to agency. Those who insist that suffering builds character often do so from positions insulated from it. Pain does not instruct by default, it only informs when understood. Untreated suffering does not ennoble, it brutalizes. It narrows vision and shortens patience. Relief, when possible, is not indulgence, it is responsibility. The idea that hardship is inherently virtuous collapses under scrutiny. If that were true, the most virtuous would be the most damaged. Yet no one truly believes this. Suffering is tolerated, not admired. When alternatives exist, they are always chosen. This reveals the truth. Endurance is praised only when relief is unavailable. Technology exposed this contradiction. Once light extended the day, no one argued for darkness. Once communication bridged distance, no one demanded isolation. Once machines reduced labor, no one volunteered to return to exhaustion. Progress was accepted because it worked. And still, resistance persisted wherever belief confused hardship with holiness. Each invention had to fight not nature, but doctrine. Each step forward had to break a taboo before it could build a future. When inquiry finally prevailed, the results were undeniable. Lifespans doubled, infant mortality plummeted, entire categories of suffering disappeared. These were not gifts bestowed, they were problems solved. Yet alongside this progress came a sobering realization. Ignorance had cost more lives than malice. Countless deaths occurred not because solutions were impossible, but because questions were forbidden. Knowledge delayed is life denied. This is why education remains the central struggle. An informed mind is difficult to dominate. It asks for evidence. It expects coherence. It recognizes manipulation. Systems that depend on obedience cannot tolerate these traits. They survive by discouraging inquiry, by substituting reverence for understanding. Fear is the preferred instrument. Fear of punishment, fear of exclusion, fear of uncertainty. These fears are cultivated early, before critical habits form. Once embedded, they defend themselves. A frightened mind resists freedom, even when offered. Yet fear dissolves under examination. Once a threat is analyzed and found empty, its power evaporates. This is why questioning is dangerous to dogma. Questions do not attack, they expose. Moral language has often been hijacked to protect authority. Words like duty, obedience, and sacrifice are praised without asking who benefits. Genuine morality does not require submission. It requires awareness. Harm is wrong because it harms, not because it violates a command. There is no such thing as sin in the cosmic sense. There are actions and consequences. There are mistakes and injuries. To label these as offenses against the universe is to distract from repairing them. Responsibility does not require condemnation. It requires correction. The finality of death sharpens this responsibility. If life ends completely, then every moment carries unrepeatable value. There is no rehearsal. There is no compensation later. Kindness delayed may never arrive. Forgiveness withheld may never be heard. This awareness does not make life bleak. It makes it urgent. It strips away trivial grievances and exposes what matters. Petty hatreds lose their appeal when time is finite. Pride shrinks when it cannot be redeemed later. Every injustice becomes permanent once its victim is gone. No apology reaches the dead. No regret restores a stolen hour. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for care. If existence ends, then suffering inflicted is absolute. No afterlife can soften it. No future balance can excuse it. Ethics become immediate, not deferred. Humanity becomes the measure, not a metaphor. The choice, then, is not between belief and emptiness. It is between illusion and responsibility, between surrender and engagement, between explaining suffering and reducing it. Those who fear this choice often claim that without belief, morality collapses. History suggests the opposite. The most brutal acts have been justified by certainty, not doubt. Atrocities require conviction. Cruelty flourishes when dissent is silenced by divine authority. Doubt, by contrast, encourages caution. It asks whether harm is necessary. It hesitates before declaring righteousness. It leaves room for correction. When people are taught to kneel, They learn obedience. When they are taught to stand, they learn balance. Standing upright requires effort. It demands attention. It exposes one to risk. But it also allows vision. To live without fear of supernatural reprisal is not to live without limits. Limits remain, imposed by reality. Bodies break. Time ends. Actions echo. These constraints are not softened by belief, only obscured. Freedom does not remove consequence. It clarifies it. The most dangerous myth is not that life has meaning imposed from above, but that meaning cannot be created below. Meaning arises from connection, effort, and care. It is built, not revealed. When loyalty shifts from abstraction to humanity, priorities reorder themselves. Schools matter more than sanctuaries. Healing matters more than ritual. Justice matters more than obedience. This is not hostility toward tradition. It is fidelity to life. Traditions that enhance well-being endure. Those that demand suffering collapse eventually, though not without cost. The task ahead is neither simple nor complete. Ignorance regenerates. Fear mutates. Authority adapts. But so does understanding. Each generation inherits both the damage and the tools to repair it. To choose humanity over illusion is not to deny wonder. The universe remains vast, complex, and unresolved. Mystery persists. The difference is that mystery is no longer weaponized. It becomes invitation rather than threat. In this space, a thinking voice replaces a pleading one. It does not ask for permission to exist. It accepts existence and asks what can be done with it. And that question, once allowed, changes everything. Part 3. When existence is stripped of sacred explanation, it does not become empty. It becomes precise. Each claim must justify itself. Each rule must answer for its effects. Authority must demonstrate competence rather than demand reverence. This transition unsettles inherited hierarchies because many of them were never designed to withstand inspection. The habit of obedience is learned early. It rewards compliance and punishes deviation. Over time, it conditions the mind to equate submission with safety. Thought becomes cautious, then timid. Questions feel dangerous not because they are harmful, but because they threaten the framework that promises protection. In such an environment, certainty is valued over accuracy, yet certainty is often the enemy of truth. It closes inquiry prematurely. It transforms assumptions into conclusions. Once something is declared unquestionable, it stops evolving. Reality, however, does not freeze to accommodate belief. It continues, indifferent to doctrine. When belief refuses to adjust, it fractures. This fracture explains much of human conflict. Groups anchored to incompatible certainties cannot negotiate because compromise appears as betrayal. Each side claims absolute endorsement. Violence then becomes moralized. Harm is reframed as duty. History records the outcome with brutal consistency. By contrast, systems grounded in evidence remain flexible. They revise themselves when new information appears. Error is not punished as heresy. It is corrected as part of learning. This humility is not weakness. It is strength refined by feedback. Ethics function the same way. When moral rules are treated as immutable commands, they lose relevance. They cannot respond to context. They cannot adapt to complexity. When ethics are grounded in consequences, they remain alive. They ask what reduces harm, what increases well-being, what preserves dignity. This approach does not produce moral chaos. It produces moral labor. Decisions become harder, not easier, because they require judgment rather than obedience. Responsibility cannot be outsourced. Each choice carries weight. The claim that people require fear to behave ethically reveals more about authority than about humanity. Fear suppresses behavior temporarily. It does not cultivate understanding. Once surveillance fades, so does compliance. Integrity, by contrast, persists without witnesses. Those who act ethically only when observed are not moral. They are cautious. Ethics grounded in empathy do not require threat. They operate because harm is understood, not because punishment is anticipated. The illusion of divine oversight has often been used to excuse surveillance and control. When power claims moral infallibility, dissent becomes immoral by definition. At that point, injustice cannot be challenged without being condemned. Tyranny thrives under sacred justification. Freedom of thought disrupts this arrangement. It exposes the difference between authority and competence. It reveals that many rules exist not to protect people, but to preserve influence. Once revealed, such rules lose legitimacy. This is why liberation movements have always faced moral condemnation before being accepted. Challenges to hierarchy are framed as threats to order. Progress is accused of corruption. Yet time repeatedly demonstrates that expanded freedom correlates with improved conditions, not collapse. Consider how perspectives change once fear recedes. Death loses its function as leverage. Guilt loses its supernatural amplification. Shame becomes proportional rather than infinite. The mind, released from eternal threat, begins to reason. This reasoning does not erase grief or uncertainty. Loss remains painful. Meaning remains something to be constructed, but suffering is no longer interpreted as deserved. It becomes a problem to address, not a verdict to accept. Under this lens, social responsibility deepens. Injustice cannot be dismissed as fate. Poverty cannot be excused as destiny. Inequality cannot be sanctified. Each condition demands explanation and, if preventable, correction. The idea that suffering is instructive collapses when examined at scale. Entire populations do not need torment to mature. Children do not require cruelty to learn. Societies do not improve through deprivation. They improve through stability, education, and opportunity. When people are told their suffering has purpose, they are less likely to demand change. This is not accidental. Consolation has often been used as containment. Hope deferred becomes control. True hope operates differently. It motivates action. It identifies achievable improvements and works toward them. It does not promise perfection later. It pursues reduction of harm now. In this framework, compassion becomes strategic rather than sentimental. It seeks systems that prevent suffering rather than merely reacting to it. Charity is replaced by justice. Pity yields to policy. The responsibility to build such systems cannot be delegated to metaphysics. It belongs to human institutions, human reasoning, and human courage. Failure to act cannot be forgiven by belief. Consequences remain. This awareness sharpens the value of time. Hours wasted in fear cannot be reclaimed. Energy spent appeasing illusions produces no return. Attention becomes a finite resource, deserving careful investment. Life lived in anticipation of another is life postponed indefinitely. Meaning delayed is meaning denied. The habit of waiting for permission to live fully results in never doing so. To reject this delay is not to indulge recklessness. It is to recognize opportunity. Joy is not a sin to be justified. It is a condition to be cultivated responsibly. Pleasure is not evidence of corruption. It is information about what sustains us. Restraint remains necessary, but it is guided by consequence, not prohibition. Harm is limited because it harms, not because it offends. This distinction matters. It preserves flexibility and prevents cruelty masquerading as virtue. As belief loosens its grip, creativity expands. Art, science, and philosophy flourish when they are not required to conform to doctrine. Expression becomes exploration. Thought becomes experiment. Even disagreement becomes productive. Without sacred conclusions to defend, ideas can be tested without threatening identity. Debate becomes inquiry rather than combat. This does not eliminate conflict, but it changes its tone. Arguments revolve around evidence rather than authority. Resolution becomes possible. The mind trained to think rather than submit does not become arrogant. It becomes careful. It recognizes its limitations. It values correction. It understands that certainty is provisional. Such a mind is harder to control, but easier to cooperate with. It resists manipulation, but welcomes collaboration. It demands reasons and offers them in return. This is the foundation of genuine solidarity. Not shared belief, but shared vulnerability. Not uniform doctrine, but mutual dependence. Not fear of punishment, but commitment to care. When humanity becomes its own point of reference, ethics cease to be abstract. They become immediate. The question shifts from "what am I commanded to do?" to "what will this do to others?" This question, asked honestly, requires maturity. It cannot be answered by reciting rules. It demands awareness of context, history, and consequence. It demands attention. And attention, once cultivated, becomes the most radical act of all. Part 4. Attention, once learned, refuses to be narrow. It widens perception and dissolves false hierarchies. When one stops viewing existence as a test imposed from elsewhere, life reveals itself as a network of causes and effects in which every action participates. Nothing is isolated, nothing is exempt. This realization undermines the habit of moral outsourcing. No authority can be blamed for what humans choose to maintain. Systems persist because they are sustained. Injustice continues because it is tolerated. Ignorance survives because it is protected. These are not accidents. They are decisions made collectively, often silently. The idea that humanity is fundamentally corrupt has been useful to those who wish to rule it. If people are convinced they are broken, they will accept control as repair. If they are taught they cannot be trusted, they will surrender judgment. This narrative does not elevate morality. It dismantles confidence. Confidence, however, is not arrogance. It is the willingness to act without guarantees. It accepts uncertainty without paralysis. It acknowledges error without collapsing into guilt. A confident society does not require constant supervision. It relies on shared standards developed through experience. The alternative is perpetual childhood. When authority is framed as parental and obedience as virtue, growth is delayed indefinitely. People learn to ask permission rather than assess consequences. Initiative becomes risky. Originality becomes suspect. This is why systems built on fear resist adulthood. Maturity erodes dependency. Once individuals recognize their capacity to reason and to care, coercion loses its foundation. Moral development does not require punishment to function. It requires feedback. Harm teaches because it is felt, not because it is forbidden. Empathy emerges through connection, not command. Communities that nurture understanding reduce conflict more effectively than those that enforce obedience. The insistence that morality collapses without surveillance misunderstands motivation. People do not avoid harm only because they are watched. They avoid it because they understand its impact. When understanding is absent, punishment merely suppresses behavior temporarily. It does not transform it. Transformation requires insight. Insight requires education. Education requires freedom. Freedom, however, is often misrepresented as chaos. This is deliberate. Those who benefit from rigid control portray flexibility as danger. Yet history shows that societies with greater freedom of thought produce more stable solutions, not fewer. Adaptability is resilience. Rigid systems fracture under pressure. Flexible systems bend and recover. Dogma shatters when reality contradicts it. Inquiry adjusts. This distinction matters because the world is not static. Conditions change. Technologies evolve. Populations grow. Problems multiply in complexity. Solutions frozen in sacred language cannot respond effectively. Consider how many injustices persisted because they were once declared eternal. How many cruelties were justified because they were tradition. Each was defended until it became indefensible, not by revelation, but by reason. Progress does not arrive gently. It unsettles. It challenges identity. It exposes complicity. Resistance is predictable. Those invested in certainty fear revision. Those invested in power fear accountability. Yet accountability is the price of maturity. It replaces excuses with explanations. It replaces punishment with prevention. It asks not who sinned, but what failed. Under this lens, even failure gains value. Mistakes become data. Errors become instruction. Learning accelerates. This approach does not eliminate suffering, but it reduces unnecessary suffering. It does not promise perfection, but it rejects resignation. It treats improvement as obligation, not option. The belief that suffering is inevitable often functions as permission to ignore it. While some pain cannot yet be avoided, much can. To declare all suffering meaningful is to abandon those who could be helped. When life is framed as preparation for another state, present injustice becomes tolerable. When life is recognized as final, injustice becomes intolerable. Urgency replaces patience. action replaces prayer. This emergency does not require despair. It requires prioritization. Trivial conflicts lose significance. Status loses importance. What remains is the question of contribution. What does one add by existing? Does one reduce harm or increase it? Does one clarify or confuse? Does one support growth or sustain stagnation? These are not questions answered once. They must be revisited continuously. Circumstances shift, knowledge expands, responsibility evolves. The refusal to accept inherited answers creates space for this evolution. It allows values to be tested rather than recited. It invites dialogue rather than decree. In such dialogue, disagreement is not betrayal. It is participation. Difference becomes resource rather than threat. Uniformity is no longer mistaken for unity. Unity grounded in fear fractures quickly. Unity grounded in mutual respect endures. It does not require sameness. It requires commitment to shared conditions, safety, dignity, opportunity. The old habit of dividing the world into pure and corrupt collapses under scrutiny. People are complex, not categories. Actions are contextual, not absolute. Moral clarity improves when nuance is allowed. This does not excuse harm. It explains it. Explanation is the first step toward prevention. Condemnation alone satisfies emotion but solves nothing. A society that prioritizes explanation over blame invests in long-term stability. It studies causes rather than staging rituals of punishment. It measures outcomes rather than intentions. Intentions, while important, do not negate impact. Good motives cannot erase harm. Recognition of this fact strengthens ethics rather than weakening them. It anchors morality in reality. Reality is indifferent to declarations. It responds only to interaction. Systems work or fail regardless of belief. Bridges stand or collapse independent of prayer. Bodies heal or deteriorate according to conditions, not devotion. This indifference is not cruelty. It is consistency. It allows learning. It rewards accuracy. Once this consistency is accepted, a certain calm emerges. Anxiety driven by supernatural threat fades. Fear loses its cosmic amplification. Life becomes demanding but navigable. The demand is effort. The navigation requires thought. Meaning in this landscape is not granted, it is assembled. It emerges from engagement, not obedience, from building rather than waiting. Those who wait for instruction often miss opportunity. Those who act without reflection cause damage. The balance lies in deliberate participation. Participation means accepting limitation. No one solves everything. No one escapes consequence. No one lives without error, but each can reduce harm within reach. This reduction is not trivial. Small changes compound. Each act of clarity weakens confusion. Each act of care counters cruelty. Each refusal to surrender thought preserves dignity. The idea that dignity must be bestowed from above dissolves. Dignity becomes inherent, expressed through action rather than permission. Standing upright is not rebellion, it is posture. It signals readiness rather than defiance. In this posture, the thinking voice does not shout, it speaks clearly. It does not demand belief. It invites examination. And examination, once begun, rarely stops. Part 5. Examination, once internalized, becomes habit. It reshapes how events are interpreted and how decisions are made. Instead of asking what is permitted, the mind asks what is effective. Instead of seeking approval, it seeks understanding. This shift alters the rhythm of life itself. Under belief-driven frameworks, life often feels supervised. Even solitude is crowded with invisible observers. Thoughts are monitored. Doubt is suspect. Desire requires justification. This constant surveillance produces anxiety disguised as virtue. Relief is promised, but only after obedience is proven. When that framework dissolves, silence changes character. It is no longer filled with judgment. It becomes space. In that space, thought can stretch, questions can form without fear of punishment. Identity loosens its armor. This does not mean certainty replaces belief. It means uncertainty becomes tolerable. Not knowing is no longer a moral failure. It is a condition of inquiry. From this condition, learning proceeds. Learning is rarely dramatic. It accumulates. It corrects itself slowly. It advances by revising assumptions, not defending them. This is why intellectual humility is more powerful than conviction. Conviction resists evidence. Humility absorbs it. Societies that reward humility over certainty tend to innovate. Those that reward certainty over accuracy tend to stagnate. The difference lies not in intelligence, but in permission. Permission to revise, permission to be wrong. Dogma forbids this permission. Once a claim is declared absolute, evidence becomes irrelevant. Reality must bend or be denied. When denial becomes widespread, delusion normalizes. Delusion is not harmless. It distorts priorities. It reallocates resources away from solutions toward symbols. It elevates loyalty over competence. It excuses failure as mystery. This is why large-scale harm so often persists under sacred narratives. Famine becomes destiny. Disease becomes lesson. Violence becomes purification. Each reframing removes responsibility from those who could intervene. Responsibility, when accepted, transforms institutions. Health becomes infrastructure rather than prayer. Education becomes investment rather than indulgence. Justice becomes repair rather than punishment. Punishment has always been easier than prevention. It satisfies anger. It performs authority. But it rarely reduces recurrence. Prevention requires understanding. It demands patience, data, and sustained effort. Belief systems that emphasize punishment over prevention reveal their priorities. They are less concerned with reducing harm than with enforcing order. Order, in this context, means predictability of behavior, not well-being. Well-being, by contrast, is messy. It varies. It requires adjustment. It demands listening. It cannot be commanded into existence. Listening is incompatible with absolute authority. Authority speaks. It does not hear. Dialogue threatens hierarchy because it equalizes voices. Evidence threatens doctrine because it introduces comparison. This is why free inquiry is inseparable from dignity. To be heard is to be acknowledged as capable of contributing to understanding. To be silenced is to be reduced to an object of control. The human cost of silence is immense. When people cannot question, errors persist. When they cannot report harm, abuse multiplies. When they cannot revise rules, injustice hardens. Every major ethical advancement followed the same path. Someone questioned what was considered unquestionable. Someone noticed harm where tradition saw order. Someone refused to accept explanation as excuse. These individuals were rarely celebrated at first. They were accused of disruption, disrespect, and danger. Yet later, their insights were absorbed and normalized. What was once heresy became common sense. This pattern exposes the weakness of sacred certainty. It ages poorly. It requires constant defense. It fears comparison. It punishes dissent not because dissent is wrong, but because it is effective. Truth does not require punishment to survive. It tolerates scrutiny. It benefits from challenge. It strengthens when tested. When life is oriented around truth rather than belief, priorities align with outcomes. Effort flows toward what works. Failure is not hidden, it is analyzed. Success is not sanctified, it is replicated. This pragmatic orientation does not eliminate meaning, it grounds it. Meaning arises from contribution, from reducing suffering, from increasing capacity. It is felt, not promised. The promise of future reward often undermines present action. When compensation is deferred indefinitely, urgency dissolves. When consequences are immediate, care intensifies. Care, however, must be informed. Sentiment alone cannot solve structural problems. Compassion requires tools. Tools require knowledge. Knowledge requires freedom. Freedom, in this sense, is not the absence of limits. It is the presence of choice informed by understanding. It allows navigation rather than drift. Drift is what occurs when belief substitutes for thinking. Life becomes reactive. Decisions follow inherited scripts. Responsibility disperses into ritual. Ritual without reflection becomes habit. Habit without awareness becomes inertia. Inertia resists change even when harm is evident. Breaking inertia requires discomfort. It demands confronting familiar explanations and finding them insufficient. This moment often feels like loss. Certainty disappears. Identity trembles. Yet what follows is not emptiness but recalibration. Values are rebuilt on sturdier ground. Ethics are refined through experience. Confidence returns, quieter but stronger. This confidence does not claim omniscience, it accepts limitation. It recognizes that improvement is incremental. It commits to direction rather than destination. Direction matters more than doctrine. Moving toward reduced harm, expanded opportunity, and shared dignity is measurable. Belief in perfection is not required. The insistence on perfection has excused enormous cruelty. When ideals are declared flawless, people become expendable. Reality is sacrificed to theory. Lives are treated as means, but human-centered ethic reverses this logic. Ideas are evaluated by their effects on people, not people by their conformity to ideas. This inversion protects dignity. Dignity in this context is not earned through obedience. It is acknowledged through treatment. How one is treated reveals how one is valued. Systems that degrade dignity in the name of virtue betray their purpose. Virtue that harms is misnamed. It is discipline without compassion, order without justice. Justice requires context. It distinguishes between intent and impact without ignoring either. It aims to restore balance, not enforce suffering. Restoration is difficult work. It demands patience, resources, and humility. It does not satisfy the desire for spectacle, but it produces stability. Stability achieved through fear is brittle. Stability achieved through trust endures. Trust cannot be commanded. It must be built. It grows from consistency, transparency, and accountability. These qualities thrive in open systems. Open systems require courage. They expose failure. They invite criticism. They risk embarrassment. Yet they adapt. Closed systems protect pride at the expense of progress. They silence warning signs. They collapse suddenly. The choice between these systems is not philosophical abstraction. It shapes daily life. It determines whether suffering is addressed or explained away. To choose examination over belief is to choose participation over submission. It is to accept the burden of thought in exchange for the freedom to act. This exchange is demanding. It offers no guarantees, but it offers something belief never can: the ability to respond to reality as it is, not as it is imagined. And in that response, meaning is not received. It is made. Part 6. What emerges over time is a different relationship to authority. Authority is no longer assumed to be correct by position alone. It must demonstrate usefulness, coherence, and accountability. Respect is no longer automatic. It is earned through service and competence. This change is unsettling to institutions built on reverence, but it is essential to societies built on trust. When authority is examined rather than worshipped, it becomes lighter. It no longer carries the impossible burden of infallibility. It can admit error without collapse. It can revise policy without humiliation. This flexibility does not weaken governance. It stabilizes it. Point. In contrast, infallible authority is brittle. One exposed error threatens the entire structure. To avoid collapse, errors are hidden, critics are silenced, and reality is denied. Over time, this denial accumulates until failure becomes catastrophic. The same dynamic applies to personal identity. When individuals define themselves through unquestionable beliefs, doubt becomes existential threat. Change feels like annihilation. Growth stalls. When identity is grounded in values rather than doctrines, adaptation becomes possible. One can revise beliefs without losing selfhood. This distinction explains why some cling desperately to certainty, even when it harms them. Certainty offers belonging, structure, and relief from ambiguity. It promises order in a chaotic world. But the price is high: intellectual stagnation, moral rigidity, and vulnerability to manipulation. Ambiguity, though uncomfortable, is honest. It reflects the actual condition of existence. The universe offers no final explanations, only patterns to be discovered and revised. Accepting this uncertainty does not paralyze action. It clarifies it. Decisions are made with awareness of risk rather than denial of it. Risk acknowledged is manageable. Risk denied becomes fate. In a belief-centered worldview, fate dominates. Events are interpreted as inevitable, ordained, or meaningful, regardless of their preventability. This interpretation dampens initiative. Why intervene if outcomes are already decided? Why struggle if suffering has purpose? Once fate is dismissed, intervention becomes duty. Preventable harm becomes unacceptable. The question shifts from, "Why did this happen?" to "Why was this allowed to continue?" This shift reframes ethics from obedience to care. Care is active. It monitors conditions. It anticipates consequences. It adjusts behavior accordingly. Care does not wait for permission. The habit of waiting has cost humanity dearly. Waiting for signs, waiting for approval, waiting for rescue. Meanwhile, problems compound. Delays become disasters. Progress occurs when waiting ends. When people stop asking whether they are allowed to act and start asking whether action is needed. This is the moment when responsibility becomes collective rather than deferred. Collective responsibility does not erase individual agency. It amplifies it. Each contribution matters because it interacts with others. Small efforts aggregate. Systems shift. This aggregation is why ideas matter. Beliefs shape behavior. Behavior shapes systems. Systems shape lives. When beliefs discourage inquiry, systems stagnate. When beliefs encourage responsibility, systems evolve. Language plays a crucial role here. Words frame possibility. Terms like destiny, providence, and divine will shrink the space for action. Terms like cause, effect, prevention, and responsibility expand it. This is not merely semantic. It is operational. The vocabulary a society uses determines the questions it asks and the solutions it considers legitimate. A society fluent in causes seeks cures. A society fluent in judgment seeks punishment. A society fluent in evidence invests in research. A society fluent in reverence invests in monuments. Monuments impress, but they do not heal. Rituals comfort, but they do not correct. Correction requires confrontation with uncomfortable facts. Facts are indifferent to belief. They persist regardless of interpretation. Ignoring them does not negate them. It delays response. Delay increases cost. This is evident in every domain, from health to environment to governance. Problems dismissed as exaggerated or forbidden eventually demand attention under worse conditions. Early action is always cheaper than late repentance. Repentance, while emotionally satisfying, is strategically useless. It addresses guilt, not cause. It soothes conscience without altering conditions. Without change, the same harm recurs. Change requires understanding mechanisms. Mechanisms require study. Study requires openness. Openness requires freedom from fear. Fear closes the mind. It narrows attention. It favors familiar explanations. It resists novelty. While fear can mobilize temporarily, it exhausts quickly. It cannot sustain thoughtful effort. Hope, grounded in realism, however, sustains. It acknowledges difficulty without exaggeration. It recognizes limits without surrender. It motivates steady work rather than dramatic gesture. This kind of hope is incompatible with fantasies of perfection. It does not expect salvation. It expects improvement. Improvement is measurable. Salvation is not. When improvement becomes the goal, progress can be tracked. Strategies can be adjusted. Successes can be replicated. Failures can be learned from. Learning from failure requires removing shame from error. Shame suppresses reporting. Suppression conceals problems. Concealment magnifies damage. Cultures that punish error harshly create incentives to hide it. Cultures that treat error as information create incentives to reveal it. The difference determines whether systems self-correct or self-destruct. This principle applies personally as well. Individuals taught that doubt is sin learn to suppress uncertainty. They avoid reflection. Over time, this avoidance erodes judgment. Individuals taught that questioning is growth learn to examine themselves. They recognize bias. They correct course. They mature. Maturity, in this sense, is not the absence of belief, but the presence of discernment. It is the ability to hold ideas provisionally, to revise without shame, to act without certainty. Acting without certainty does not mean acting recklessly. It means acting based on best available evidence while remaining open to correction. This is how science progresses. This is how ethics evolve. Ethics that cannot evolve become instruments of harm. Ethics that evolve become instruments of care. The future depends not on belief, but on capacity. Capacity to learn, to adapt, to cooperate, to repair. These capacities are cultivated, not bestowed. Cultivation takes time. It requires patience. It demands institutions designed to teach rather than command, to support rather than threaten. Threat produces compliance. Support produces competence. Competence produces resilience. Resilience matters because challenges will not diminish. Complexity will increase. Solutions will require coordination across differences. Shared belief will not be sufficient. Shared commitment will. Commitment to evidence. Commitment to dignity. Commitment to reducing harm, even when it conflicts with tradition. This commitment does not need sanctification. It needs maintenance. Maintenance is unglamorous. It lacks spectacle. It consists of steady effort, repeated correction, and continuous attention. Yet it is what sustains civilization. Civilization is not built by declarations. It is built by systems that work. To prefer systems that work over stories that comfort is not cynicism. It is care expressed through realism. And realism, once embraced, does not diminish humanity. It trusts humanity enough to give it responsibility. That trust, extended and honored, becomes the foundation upon which a more honest future can be built. Part 7. Trusting humanity with responsibility changes how power is distributed. Power shifts away from those who claim exclusive access to truth and toward those who can demonstrate understanding. This redistribution is often mistaken for disrespect. In reality, it is alignment. Authority becomes aligned with function rather than myth. Function can be evaluated, it can be measured, it can fail and be replaced. Myth cannot. Myth demands loyalty, regardless of outcome. This difference determines whether institutions improve or decay. Decay is rarely sudden. It begins with small distortions. Language becomes evasive. Accountability becomes selective. Harm is reframed as necessity. Over time, the distance between stated values and lived reality widens. Eventually, the structure collapses under its own contradictions. Open systems resist this decay by allowing correction before collapse. They surface problems early. They distribute responsibility widely. They recognize that no single perspective captures the whole. This recognition encourages pluralism, not as tolerance for its own sake, but as strategy. Diverse viewpoints reveal blind spots. Disagreement exposes assumptions. Consensus reached through examination is stronger than unity imposed through silence. Pluralism does not require relativism. Not all ideas are equal. Some explanations work better than others. Some policies reduce harm more effectively. Evidence discriminates without dehumanizing. It sorts ideas, not people. This distinction is crucial. When people are treated as wrong rather than ideas being evaluated as inadequate, dialogue ends. Identity becomes entangled with belief. Revision becomes humiliation. Conflict escalates. Separating self-worth from opinion allows learning. One can discard an idea without discarding dignity. This separation is fragile and must be taught. It does not arise naturally in environments of fear. Fear teaches defensiveness. Defensiveness blocks listening. Listening is the gateway to cooperation. Cooperation is not sentimental. It is necessary. The problems facing humanity are not isolated. Disease, climate, inequality, and conflict cross borders. Solutions require coordination beyond shared mythology. They require shared information and mutual trust. Trust, in turn, requires transparency. Transparency requires institutions willing to be scrutinized. Scrutiny requires cultures that value truth over appearance. Appearance has long been mistaken for substance. Grand declarations, sacred symbols, and moral posturing create the illusion of virtue. Substance is quieter. It shows in outcomes, not slogans. When outcomes are prioritized, ethical clarity improves. Policies are judged by their effects, not their intentions. Intentions matter, but they do not override results. This realism protects those most vulnerable to failure. Vulnerability exposes the cost of abstraction. Those insulated from consequence can afford symbolic solutions. Those exposed cannot. For them, effectiveness is not philosophical, it is survival. An ethic grounded in reality centers these experiences. It asks how systems function at their weakest points. It designs for failure rather than assuming perfection. Assuming perfection has justified immense neglect. When institutions are declared flawless, those harmed by them are dismissed as defective. Blame shifts downward. Power remains unchallenged. Challenging power is not rebellion, it is maintenance. Systems require pressure to remain aligned with purpose. Without challenge, they drift towards self-preservation. Self-preservation is not inherently evil, but it becomes destructive when it overrides service. Institutions exist to serve needs, not to perpetuate themselves indefinitely. When survival becomes the goal, function erodes. This erosion often hides behind moral language. Loyalty is demanded. Criticism is framed as betrayal. Dissent is cast as danger. These signals indicate fragility, not strength. Strength invites scrutiny. It does not fear exposure. It corrects rather than conceals. The same applies personally. A resilient individual does not require constant validation. They adjust behavior when confronted with evidence. They apologize when harm is caused. They change. Change is not failure. Refusal to change is. The mythology of fixed identity has done as much damage as the mythology of fixed truth. People are not static. Values evolve. Understanding deepens. Clinging to outdated frameworks out of pride or fear limits growth. Growth requires letting go of explanations that no longer fit. This process is uncomfortable. It involves grief for lost certainty. But it also brings relief. The effort of maintaining contradiction ends. Contradiction is exhausting. It demands denial. It consumes attention. It produces anxiety. Coherence, once restored, frees energy. This energy can be directed outward, toward creation rather than defense, toward repair rather than justification. Repair acknowledges imperfection without surrender. It focuses on what can be improved rather than what should have been. It treats history as instruction, not scripture. Scripture freezes the past. Instruction learns from it. Learning from the past reveals a consistent pattern. Progress follows when fear loosens its grip and inquiry advances. Setbacks occur when certainty hardens and power concentrates. This pattern is not destiny, it is tendency. Tendencies can be countered. Awareness disrupts inertia. Awareness begins with attention, but it must continue with action. Understanding without application remains abstract. Ethics without practice become rhetoric. Practice reveals gaps between intention and effect. It exposes unintended consequences. This exposure is not indictment, it is information. Information is only useful if it is acted upon. This requires courage. Correcting course publicly risks embarrassment. It may cost status, but it preserves integrity. Integrity is not consistency with belief. It is consistency with evidence and values. When evidence changes, integrity requires revision. This definition of integrity unsettles those who equate steadfastness with virtue. But steadfastness in error is not admirable. It is stubbornness dressed as principle. Principle lives in direction, not rigidity. It aims toward reduced harm, increased understanding, and shared dignity. How it achieves these aims evolves. This evolution does not weaken commitment. It refines it. As humanity faces increasingly complex challenges, this refinement becomes urgent. Simplistic answers fail under pressure. Myth collapses when consequences escalate. What remains is the capacity to think together, to share data, to coordinate response, to admit uncertainty and proceed anyway. Proceeding anyway is the mark of maturity. It accepts that waiting for certainty means waiting forever. It acts responsibly with incomplete information, adjusting as outcomes appear. This approach does not promise control. It promises responsiveness. Responsiveness is enough. It allows survival. It allows improvement. It allows meaning to be constructed rather than assumed. Meaning constructed through action is resilient. It adapts. It survives disillusionment. It does not collapse when stories fail. In this construction, no one is elevated beyond critique, no idea is beyond revision, no suffering is beyond concern. This is not utopia. It is work. Work without illusion, without appeal to invisible authorities, without deferred responsibility. Work grounded in the reality of human limitation and human potential. Such work does not need blessing. It needs commitment, and commitment, once chosen, becomes its own justification. Part 8. Commitment, when stripped of spectacle, becomes endurance, not the endurance of suffering for its own sake, but the endurance required to keep correcting course. It is easier to proclaim certainty than to sustain effort. Declarations cost little. Maintenance costs everything. The most persistent failures in human history were not caused by lack of belief, but by refusal to revise. Warnings were ignored because they threatened narratives. Evidence was dismissed because it contradicted authority. By the time correction was unavoidable, damage had compounded. This pattern repeats whenever systems value loyalty over accuracy. Accuracy feels cold to those raised on reverence, but it is compassionate in effect. Accurate understanding allows precise intervention. Imprecise belief produces blunt responses. Blunt responses injure broadly. They punish indiscriminately. They satisfy emotion while worsening conditions. Precision, by contrast, targets causes. It reduces collateral harm. It requires patience and skill. Skill develops only through practice and feedback. Feedback requires openness. Openness requires safety. People do not report problems in environments that punish honesty. They conceal them. Concealment protects appearance while undermining function. This is why cultures of fear rot from within. They appear stable until they are not. Their collapse is sudden because decay was hidden. Cultures of openness appear messy, but they adapt continuously. Their disorder is visible, but manageable. Visibility is often mistaken for weakness. In reality, it is the opposite. Seeing problems early is advantage. Acknowledging limitation allows preparation. Denial offers comfort only until reality intervenes. Reality always intervenes. When it does, belief offers no insulation. Only capacity matters. Capacity to respond, to coordinate, to learn under pressure. These capacities are built long before crisis arrives. They cannot be improvised in panic. This is why the slow work of education, infrastructure, and trust matters more than dramatic gestures. Drama exhausts. Systems sustain. Systems grounded in evidence do not require perfection to function. They require correction. Correction is continuous. It never finishes. Those who promise final answers misunderstand the nature of living systems. Life does not converge on a solution. It unfolds. Conditions shift. New challenges emerge. Old solutions expire. The desire for finality is understandable. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. But finality is illusion. Accepting this frees energy otherwise spent defending what cannot last. Defending illusions consumes attention that could be used to build resilience. It traps intelligence in justification rather than application. It prioritizes narrative over outcome. Outcome-focused thinking reframes success. Success is not purity. It is reduction of harm. It is increased capacity. It is fewer preventable deaths, fewer unnecessary losses, fewer wasted lives. These measures are unromantic. They do not inspire poetry. They inspire relief. Relief is often undervalued because it is quiet. Pain announces itself. Its absence does not. When suffering is reduced, attention moves on. The work that made it possible is forgotten. This forgetfulness fuels the return of harmful ideas. Once relief is normalized, its origins are obscured. Myths regain appeal. Suffering is reinterpreted. Cycles repeat. Breaking these cycles requires memory. Not nostalgia, but record. Documentation of cause and effect. History understood as process rather than legend. Legend simplifies. It glorifies. It selects heroes and villains. Process complicates. It reveals systems, incentives, and feedback loops. It resists moral theater. Moral theater is satisfying but unproductive. It assigns blame without altering structure. It resolves tension emotionally while preserving the conditions that created it. Structural change is slow. It lacks spectacle. It requires persistence across generations. It demands humility from those who benefit least visibly. This is why appeals to invisible reward have been effective. They motivate sacrifice without evidence. They promise compensation beyond verification. They exploit hope. Hope deserves better. It should be anchored to possibility, not fantasy. Hope grounded in evidence does not guarantee success, but it justifies effort. Effort justified by fantasy collapses when fantasy fails. Effort justified by evidence adjusts. Adjustment is the defining skill of survival. Species survive by adapting, not by insisting. Societies survive by learning, not by obeying. Learning requires admitting ignorance. This admission threatens pride, but strengthens capacity. Pride defends image, capacity defends life. The choice between image and life is rarely framed honestly. Image is called honor, faithfulness, loyalty. Life is called compromise, weakness, doubt. Language is weaponized to preserve illusion. Seeing through this weaponization is not cynicism, it is literacy. It allows one to recognize when words are being used to obscure rather than clarify. Clarity is not cruelty, it is respect for reality. It treats problems as solvable rather than sanctified. It treats people as capable rather than corrupt. This respect is transformative. When people are trusted with truth, many rise to meet it. When they are treated as inherently flawed, they behave defensively. Defensiveness fragments cooperation. Trust consolidates it. Trust, however, is fragile. It cannot survive repeated deception. When institutions preach virtue while practicing exploitation, trust erodes. When leaders demand sacrifice while insulating themselves, legitimacy collapses. Legitimacy cannot be restored through rhetoric. It requires change in behavior. Accountability must be visible. Consequences must be real. This applies at every scale. Personal integrity mirrors institutional integrity. One cannot demand honesty while practicing evasion. One cannot condemn harm while excusing it when convenient. Consistency between value and action is the measure of seriousness. Without it, principles are decoration. Decoration has its place, but it cannot substitute for structure. Structure holds weight. It carries load. When stress arrives, decoration fails. The stress of the future will be immense. Population pressures, environmental instability, technological acceleration. These challenges will not yield to prayer or nostalgia. They will require coordination, evidence, and restraint. Restraint guided by understanding, not prohibition. Limits informed by consequence, not command. Command without understanding breeds rebellion or blind obedience. Understanding invites cooperation. Cooperation does not erase conflict. It channels it productively. It allows disagreement to refine solutions rather than fracture society. This is the promise of a thinking culture. Not harmony, but resilience. Not certainty, but capacity. Capacity to face reality without mythic cushioning. Capacity to act without supernatural permission. Capacity to find meaning in contribution rather than compliance. Such meaning is durable. It does not collapse when stories fail. It persists because it is embedded in action. Action taken with awareness, revised through feedback, sustained by commitment. This is not a creed. It is a practice. And like all practices, it demands renewal, daily, relentlessly. The thinking voice does not rest. It does not seek final answers. It asks better questions. And those questions, once asked seriously, do not return us to old illusions. Part 9. Better questions alter the terrain on which decisions are made. They do not promise comfort, they promise orientation. Instead of asking who is right, they ask what works. Instead of asking what is sacred, they ask what is necessary. This shift removes the drama from morality and replaces it with responsibility. Responsibility, unlike guilt, is forward-facing. Guilt dwells on what cannot be undone. Responsibility focuses on what can still be changed. Cultures that obsess over guilt recycle suffering. Cultures that emphasize responsibility reduce it. This distinction explains why punishment-centered systems fail to improve behavior over time. Punishment looks backward. It assigns blame, extracts pain, and declares closure. Yet the conditions that produce the harm remain intact. Responsibility looks forward. It asks how recurrence can be prevented. It modifies environments rather than moralizing outcomes. Moralizing outcomes is tempting because it is simple. It requires no structural analysis. It absolves observers of involvement. Harm becomes someone's fault, not everyone's problem. But complex systems do not produce simple failures. They produce predictable outcomes given certain conditions. Change the conditions and outcomes change. Ignore them and condemnation becomes ritual. Ritual feels like action. It satisfies the need to respond, but it rarely alters trajectory. It is theater mistaken for intervention. Intervention is quieter. It studies patterns. It adjusts incentives. It reallocates resources. It rarely offers villains or heroes. It offers explanations. Explanation threatens those invested in moral absolutism. If harm is explained, it can be prevented. Prevention removes the need for punishment. Punishment is power. Prevention distributes agency. This is why explanations have historically been resisted. They erode hierarchy. They empower the many at the expense of the few. They democratize understanding. Democratized understanding does not mean everyone agrees. It means disagreement occurs on shared ground. Evidence becomes common currency. Debate shifts from allegiance to analysis. Analysis is slower than acquisition. It requires patience. It tolerates ambiguity, but it yields durable solutions. The impatience for certainty often masquerades as strength. In reality, it is fear of complexity. Complexity cannot be commanded into submission. It must be navigated. Navigation requires maps. Maps are built from data, not doctrine. They are updated as terrain changes. Old maps are discarded without ceremony when they no longer guide effectively. Clinging to outdated maps is dangerous. It leads travelers confidently into hazards. Confidence without accuracy is liability. Accuracy without humility is also dangerous. It breeds arrogance. It forgets that maps are approximations. Reality always exceeds representation. This is why provisional thinking matters. It keeps the mind flexible. It allows correction without collapse. It accepts that today's solution may become tomorrow's problem. Such thinking resists fanaticism. Fanaticism requires final answers. It thrives on closure. It fears revision. Revision is not betrayal. It is learning. Every meaningful advance has required abandoning earlier explanations. Fire was once divine. Disease was once curse. Motion was once mystery. Each yielded to study. Study did not eliminate wonder. It redirected it. Understanding deepens awe rather than destroying it. Knowing how something works does not make it trivial. It makes it accessible. Accessibility is power. It allows participation. When knowledge is shared rather than guarded, capacity multiplies. Guarded knowledge creates dependence. Shared knowledge creates competence. Competence reduces fear. Fear reduces aggression. Aggression destroys trust. Trust is not built on shared belief. It is built on predictable behavior. Predictability emerges from transparent rules applied consistently. Transparency dissolves suspicion. Consistency enables cooperation. These qualities cannot flourish in systems that rely on mystery. Mystery protects authority, but undermines trust. When rules are justified by unknowable will, accountability disappears. Accountability requires reasons that can be examined. It requires standards that can be challenged. It requires consequences that apply to all. Equality before consequence is the foundation of justice. Not equality of outcome, but equality of obligation. No one is exempt from scrutiny. No one is beyond correction. This principle unsettles those accustomed to immunity. It also liberates those accustomed to blame. When responsibility is shared, shame decreases. Focus shifts from fault to function. Function can be improved. Fault cannot be undone. The language of fault often hides power imbalance. Those with authority define error. Those without absorb punishment. Systems improve only when this imbalance is addressed. Addressing it requires courage. Those who benefit from imbalance resist change. They invoke tradition, stability, and order. They warn of chaos. Chaos is invoked whenever control is threatened. Yet true chaos arises not from freedom, but from rigidity. Systems that cannot adapt break violently. Adaptive systems absorb stress gradually. They distribute load. They learn from strain. This learning prevents collapse. The future will test adaptability relentlessly. Environmental limits, technological acceleration, and social complexity will expose brittle structures quickly. Belief will not shield them. Only responsiveness will. Responsiveness depends on information flow. When data is suppressed to preserve narrative, response falters. When whistleblowers are punished, warnings cease. Failure accelerates. Protecting information is protecting survival. This requires cultures that value truth over comfort. Comfort is short-lived. Survival is continuous. This does not mean abandoning compassion. On the contrary, compassion becomes more effective when informed. It targets causes rather than symptoms. It builds systems rather than distributing apologies. Apologies without change are insults. They acknowledge harm while ensuring its continuation. Change honors victims. Words do not. The temptation to substitute words for action is strong. Language is easier than restructuring. Promises cost less than policy. Yet outcomes expose the difference. Exposure is uncomfortable. It reveals disparity between intention and effect. But without exposure, correction is impossible. Thus, transparency becomes ethical requirement, not procedural option. Concealment may protect reputation, but it endangers life. Life deserves better than reputation management. The measure of a society is not its declarations, but its outcomes, not what it claims to value, but what it produces. Health, education, safety, opportunity. These are tangible. They can be assessed. Assessment replaces faith. It asks whether goals are met. If not, it asks why. It does not accept mystery as answer. Mystery may inspire poetry. It does not sustain systems. Sustaining systems requires attention to detail. Small failures cascade. Minor neglect accumulates. Maintenance prevents disaster. Maintenance is undervalued because it lacks glory. Yet every functioning structure depends on it. Collapse is dramatic. Stability is silent. Silence is often mistaken for absence. In reality, it signals equilibrium. Equilibrium is earned through effort. Effort guided by understanding is efficient. Effort guided by belief is wasteful. Waste compounds. Resources misallocated to illusion cannot address reality. Time spent appeasing abstractions cannot solve concrete problems. Time is finite. Attention is finite. Energy is finite. How they are used defines outcomes. Using them wisely requires rejecting narratives that demand sacrifice without return. Sacrifice must be justified by measurable benefit. Otherwise, it is exploitation disguised as virtue. Virtue that cannot be questioned is dangerous. It shields harm. Virtue that welcomes examination protects integrity. Integrity is alignment between values and effects. When alignment is absent, values are decoration. Decorated systems impress. Aligned systems endure. Endurance does not mean stagnation. It means capacity to change without breaking. It means resilience through adaptation. Adaptation is the essence of life. It is how organisms persist. It is how cultures survive. It is how meaning remains relevant. Meaning that cannot adapt becomes relic. Relics are admired, not lived. Living meaning is active. It responds. It revises. It remains connected to consequence. This is the meaning that emerges when belief loosens and thought engages. It is not